In 1978 Los Angeles, Carson Phillips has been a private investigator for more than 20 years. Staying at the theater one night, he is forced to flee when a gang breaks in. Driving away with his cat, Carson gets to work to find a client waiting for him. Worried about her aunt's well-being at a Texan sanatorium, she insists on hiring Carson's services to check on her. Initially resisting taking the case on because of his reluctance to return to his hometown, Carson eventually agrees when he is promised whatever fee he asks for. His reluctance stemmed from his unwillingness to face his past in the form of Jane, whom he had abandoned despite her being the only woman he ever loved. Back in Texas now, he knows he will have to face the consequences of his past deeds sooner or later. Arriving at the sanatorium, Carson asks to meet Barbara Van Poole, the patient he was hired to check on. Asked to wait for a while, he eventually meets Dr. Miles Mitchell, who turns out to be his junior. While Carson used to be out on the field setting records, Miles says that he was a freshman on the bench in complete awe of his senior. Accompanying Carson to meet Barbara, Miles asks him all sorts of questions like how Carson knows Barbara and if there was any trouble. When Carson tells him that he is simply a family friend wanting to visit Barbara to cheer her up, Miles throws an excuse to state that a visit cannot be arranged that day. Requesting Miles to give him a call whenever Barbara is ready to meet, Carson takes his leave. Later that evening, he goes to a casino and meets Doc, a local power broker. Doc gives him a warm welcome before Carson recognizes a few other people, including Chief Bing Walsh, with whom Carson played football a long time ago. Joining the table then, he is dealt into a game. Introduced to one of the players, Lorenzo Rodriguez, Carson is pleased to know that he formerly worked at the sanatorium. Doc then introduces him to Rose, the casino's owner, and his daughter. The college team's present star quarterback Happy Chandler also meets him then, and insultingly expresses his disappointment in Carson having thrown away a golden opportunity at stardom. Doc asks to meet Happy in his office to defuse the tension and get the game started. Outside the casino, meanwhile, a young woman cries in her car and eyes the gun she has while having a drink. In the casino, on the other hand, slide, the local hippie plays the game for a while before cashing out. Thinking of Doc then, Carson recalls his journey from being a small-town bookie to becoming one of the biggest power brokers in the state, which in itself is a massive accomplishment. When Doc is the only one left playing, Carson is certain of winning because of his straight hand. However, Doc wins the high-stakes all or nothing when he reveals his hand to be a full house. After the game, Carson offers his sympathies to Doc on his wife's passing 12 years ago due to cancer. Speaking of Jane then, Doc informs him that she is a widow now. He also adds that she has a daughter named Becky, who is married to Happy. Noticing Happy get into a fight just then, Carson rushes to grab him. Doc reprimands him for starting a fight the night before a game and sends him home. Becky, the young woman outside the casino, grabs her gun when she sees Happy but continues to cry. Back at the motel later, Carson sees a former client waiting to meet him. Tackling his guard, Carson then speaks to Gregory, whose daughter he had helped find and bring back home. However, she had left home again in just a few hours, and Gregory knew about Carson helping her get away. He now tells him that the sob story of abuse that she must have told Carson to get him to help her was just a story and warns him to watch his back before leaving. Carson heads back to the sanatorium the next day and insists on meeting Barbara. This time, Miles tells him that she is resting and doesn't want any visitors. Suspecting odd and sinister happenings, Carson breaks into one of the wings of the sanatorium and surprisingly finds it deserted. He quickly hides when he hears Miles speaking to someone, and then proceeds further only to come across several locked doors. Eventually, reaching Miles's office, he promptly locates the filing cabinet to find Barbara's records. Along with an empty file, Carson also finds several betting tickets and interestingly notes that Miles does not bet in favor of Texas. Seeing Miles coming over, Carson quickly goes out of the window and remains out of sight. Once Miles settles in his office, Carson comes to a decision not to leave the place before finding something more about Barbara. Jumping into the trees then, he lands on the hard ground below before being helped up by a stunned patient. Asking her about Barbara, he then learns that she hasn't been around for a while. Later, Happy's big game against New Mexico is underway when Carson requests getting his photos from Miles's office developed in addition to getting his jacket cleaned. Listening to the commentary of the ongoing game, he learns about Happy leaving the field because of an injury. Rushing over, Carson sees him being carted into an ambulance and spots Jane some distance away as she hugs an emotional Becky. Considering the sensitive situation, the two do not meet each other right then, but she calls him over to her house the next morning. Finally meeting after 2 decades, the two have a somewhat awkward reunion. After telling Carson about losing her husband to a heart attack, Jane then informs him about her intention to hire his services. Becky overhears the conversation as her mother mentions the rumors going around town that Happy's passing has nothing to do with football. Stating that Happy gallivanting around town with Rose is a known fact, Jane says that Sheriff Walsh will opt for the easy solution and suspect Becky of foul play. Explaining further, she mentions having admitted herself to the sanatorium for a while after losing her husband, which had eventually taken a toll on Becky as well. Having already heard about Carson looking for Barbara, Jane also tells him that she had met her briefly during her stay at the sanatorium but is stumped as to why he isn't able to meet her. Having made her decision of hiring him, she then dismisses him. When Carson tries calling Barbara's niece to give her an update, he finds that her number is disconnected. Having been unable to refuse Jane, he then decides to begin working on Happy's case by contacting the coroner. After multiple evaded calls, Carson confronts him in the park, telling him about the high levels of ephedrine and another unrecognized substance that was found in Happy's bloodstream. The coroner also mentions a pending report from Dallas. While the coroner promises to let Carson know the results when he receives them, Jane meets Doc to ask for his help in calling the sheriff off Becky's case. In return, he asks for a 49% partnership in the oil business she manages in lieu of her late husband. When he mentions he has been helping him keep several toxicity reports under wraps over the years, she has no option but to agree with the arrangement. Before she can leave, however, he also asks her to get Carson to stop snooping around. Meeting up with Slide at the bar later, Carson learns that Miles owes so much money to Doc that he had to let go of Lorenzo. Wondering if Lorenzo deals on the side now, he also states that Happy is more likely to have approached Miles for a hit instead of Doc. Noticing a guy at the bar eavesdropping on their conversation, Carson waits outside later to check if he is followed, but he ends up seeing Lorenzo and realizes that he possibly does a lot more than simply deal on the side. At the coroner's office then, Carson learns that the reason for Happy's passing is tainted speed. He runs into the sheriff outside, who confronts him about being hired by Jane. Exactly as she had expected, Sheriff Walsh clearly thinks Becky is the culprit irrespective of any alternatives that Carson offers him. At the casino later that night, Carson shares a drink with Rose in Happy's honor. When he asks if she knew in case Happy had a habit of narcotics, she ignores the question and simply states that she likes football players. Her father soon interrupts their conversation and takes Carson out for a ride. The tissue that Rose left behind marked with her lipstick is then picked up by Lorenzo. At Doc's cabin later, he offers to tell Carson about Barbara and asks for him to go back to LA in return. When he says that neither helping with Becky's case nor snooping around the sanatorium will end well for Carson, it piques Carson's curiosity. Simply telling him that Barbara has passed, Doc offers him a police report, along with a legitimate death certificate and a will for her family. Refusing to abandon Jane again, Carson declines walking away. When he is purposefully dropped in the deserted part of town, Carson feels fortunate not to be dropped off at a bridge. However, his relief is short-lived as he is suddenly chased by armed men. Dodging their attacks, he uses his gun to take one of them down before managing to hit another as well. Left with just another goon, Carson asks him to make a choice, exclaiming that he doesn't even like the people who hired him. The guy chooses to scamper away. Sheriff Walsh meanwhile meets Doc to inform him about Carson having ended the lives of 2 hitmen from LA. Seeing the golden opportunity in this piece of information, Doc asks the sheriff to make this Carson's final warning. Making good on his promise to Doc, Sheriff Walsh meets Carson the following morning. Offering the sheriff a deal of his own, Carson asks him to stop looking into Becky and promises to leave town and return. To his surprise, Carson learns that Happy abused Becky multiple times. Furthermore, the sheriff knew about it very well but refrained from arresting the town's star quarterback. Carson is then given an alternative to either have last night's case written off as that of self-defense or to make his life in prison difficult. Carson simply chooses to meet his client and takes his leave. At Jane's place a while later, he meets Becky and learns that Happy was not into narcotics. Insisting that she had nothing to do with his passing, Becky puts an end to the conversation before Jane gets there. Carson honestly tells her that he doesn't appreciate not knowing the entire truth about Happy and Becky. Adding that the town dislikes Jane because her husband's company polluted the place. He demands to know everything about it as well. Coming clean then, Jane tells him that while her husband paid off every inspector in the state to get the company running, a lot of people got sick within the year. This had led to groundwater testing, the reports of which had come out inconclusive, possibly due to even more corruption. Saying that she came to know all of this after her husband passed, Jane then informs Carson that he is Becky's father. Overwhelmed by his feelings, Carson then reconciles with Jane. The coroner contacts Carson as promised the next day to inform him about Happy's test results. In addition to a high concentration of amphetamines and steroids, he says that doxorubicin, a cancer drug, was also found. Intrigued, as it cannot be bought without a prescription, Carson looks through the photos of patient files from Miles's office when Becky comes over. Having heard from her mother about Carson being her father, she spends some time bonding with him over a cup of coffee. A while later, an injured Slide gets there saying that he had gone to meet Lorenzo. Meanwhile, Jane gets her pills replaced after apparently dropping them down the toilet just as the cops arrive at her place. Urging Slide to come clean, Carson gets him talking. He begins by telling Carson about a conversation he overheard between Doc and Happy. As it turns out, with the exorbitant amount of money Happy owed Doc, he was asked to throw the game to clear the debt. However, curbing Happy's rising greed was then left to Miles. Carson deduces that he made all those bets so he wouldn't be suspected and then ended Happy's life. Jane calls Carson just then to inform him about Sheriff Walsh having an arrest warrant for Becky. Appealing for the sheriff to trust him, Carson tells him about the game being fixed and asks for 24 hours to find the real culprit. Carson meets Doc a while later and reveals knowing about the fixed game, throwing around his theories about Miles running a narcotics ring. Then, Carson mentions how beneficial it would be for Doc's business if Miles and Lorenzo were eliminated. Instead of getting rid of them himself, however, Doc states that he would rather watch Carson do it for him. Leaving a while later, Carson finds a note from Rose asking him to meet her at the stadium. But instead of meeting Rose there, he finds a sniper stationed there in the form of Lorenzo. Taking multiple shots at Carson, however, Lorenzo ends up knocked out by a football. Picking up his clean jacket later, Carson is struck by an idea and he heads over to the sanatorium on a hunch. Digging for a while there, he finds a buried patient just as an armed Miles gets there. Shoving a shovelful of dirt in his face, Carson attacks Miles just as Lorenzo gets there as well. In the ensuing gunfight, several lab members lose their lives trying to take Carson out. Lorenzo's relentless attacks causes a fire to spread across the lab and end Lorenzo. Rushing out then, he faces Miles even as the sanatorium's patients begin gathering behind him. When Carson urges him to confess about Happy's poisoning, he helplessly apologizes but is suddenly shot by one of the patients even as the others rejoice his end. Sheriff Walsh gets to the sanatorium later and meets Carson. Reporting everything from the blowing up of the meth lab to the buried patients across the grounds, Carson also informs him that Miles was responsible for Happy's passing. However, when Carson meets Doc to tell him about this, Doc mentions that the case isn't that simple and ambiguously hints at the limitless protective instinct of a mother. The next morning, Carson finds Jane's pills and realizes she has cancer. When he asks her about it, she tells him that she doesn't have a lot of time. Correctly figuring it all out, Carson understands that Jane lied about having met Barbara just to get him to help Becky. Recalling Doc's statement from last night, Carson asks Jane if she brought about Happy's end. Overhearing the conversation, Becky also demands the truth from her mother. Insisting that Happy was a monster, Jane confesses that she was worried about not being around to protect Becky from him, which is why she decided to get rid of him while she could. Subsequently, Carson decides not to let the opportunity of being a family pass him by for a second time and finds his rightful place at home with Jane and Becky.